Probably helps if I unmute, doesn't it? So, hey, I'm so glad to be with you all this morning. For me, it's very early morning. It's just gone 5 and the birds are just starting to chirp. But it's a really fantastic way to start the day, to be here with the AERO family, connecting, seeing some of my favorite faces here. And I hope we can enjoy the next hour and a bit together. Please forgive me if sometimes I seem to be reading, because at 5:15 a.m. It's quite possible that at times I will be reading. So I'm going to keep my notes really to hand because I don't want to leave anything out here. And I'm going to start by just opening my screen so that I can also share a couple of scribbles, if you like, that just help me keep clear on where everything is. A little bit of a mental map for some of these things. So let's just check first. Everyone can see this one? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. Then everything else is going to work nicely. So I'm just going to stop the share while I'm starting. Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about structure in education. One of the questions I know Thomas has obviously heard many, many times from parents who are trying to get their heads around a truly self-directed model is, but what if my child needs more structure? And this question kept coming up, especially because I do training also to support people in facilitating self-directed education, parents and people who are going to be facilitating people who are starting schools. And this question comes up again and again. And I started thinking about, what is it that they mean when they say my child needs more structure? And what is it that we actually provide instead of that thing that they think their child needs when they look at a completely self-directed model and they're not seeing that thing? And that led me into really looking very closely at what I was seeing in terms of how people structure their learning when it's completely self-directed. Obviously also some really amazing writing from people like Daniel Greenberg. When you really read into it, you find there as well a lot of insight into structure that isn't obviously visible in the way that coercive educational structure is really, really visible. So for me, it's a little bit like a laser beam. A laser beam can be invisible until you just put a little bit of mist there, scatter a little chalk in the air, and suddenly you see this thing. And it's been right there all along. So I'd like to shine a bit of a light onto structure the way that we don't normally perceive it. And I'd love to see if you can see what I can see. By the time we get to the end, I'll be looking forward to hearing back from you if you see it too. So with no more ado, okay, wait, I'm not going to start that slide yet. I actually want to tell you a little story from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This just occurred to me yesterday as fitting into this topic, but it's been with me for years. I was reading these stories to my son a few years ago. And in one of them, there's this beautiful little interaction between Watson and Holmes, where Dr. Watson is absolutely scandalized that Sherlock Holmes does not know that the sun does not go around the earth and that the earth actually goes around the sun. And Dr. Watson proceeds to give him the information that Sherlock Holmes definitely needs. And Sherlock's response is quite startling. He says, "I shall do my best to forget it as soon as possible." Now, I haven't got the quote here. I wasn't able to find it in these huge volumes in time. So I'll paraphrase, but he basically says, everybody's only got so much room in their attic. So it had better be packed with things they really, really need. And I don't need to know that the sun goes around the earth or the earth goes around the sun. This doesn't help me solve any cases. I need every scrap of my space for things that actually are pertinent to me. Now, obviously, that's a very extreme example, and I would be extremely surprised if anyone in a truly self-directed model came out at the end of their education without knowing that the Earth orbits the sun. But to make it a little more real, I don't think there's really a reason that I personally need to know much about solar flares or sunspots. And I certainly don't need to master the skills to be able to construct an attic. So when I look at this little interaction between Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, what I see is two different voices speaking about two different approaches to education. And the one I think of as being from the top down, and the other I think of as being from the bottom up. And that's what I want to have a closer look at today, because I think when most people say my child needs more structure, what they're thinking about is they're thinking about the kind of top-down structure that's very, very easily visible to those of us who've been through it, because we know what it looks like, we know what to expect, but they're not always aware of the bottom-up structure that actually operates in all of us, that we're all born with, that humans have used for learning throughout our entire evolution. And these two fit together in quite an interesting way, with quite a few gradations on the spectrum on their way up. And I'll be arguing today that the top-down structure actually only works to the extent that the bottom-up structure allows it to, because the bottom-up structure is what's actually fundamental and what makes learning learning, rather than, as I've just gone blank on her name, the woman who said throwing marshmallows at somebody's face and calling it eating, is too often what the top-down structure can become. So I am now going to share my screen and head on in. So this is what it looks like outside right now. I wish that tree was in my garden, but it's not. I stole the photo off Unsplash. So for those of you who've just come in, my name is Clements, and I don't mind how you pronounce it. I really enjoy all of the different varieties that I hear, especially now that I'm interacting very internationally. It's great. And my field is the philosophy, theory, and practice of self-directed education specifically. And today I'm going to be running you through some insights I have into the idea of structure in education. So pretty much all of us know what the structure of mainstream school education looks like, because pretty much all of us experienced it firsthand and close up for most of our childhood years. What most of us experienced would be, using some philosophical jargon, nationalist essentialism with a smattering of progressivism or perennialism if we were lucky, deployed with a dose of behaviorism usually. But even those of us who experienced a more humanist education, unless we were lucky enough to go somewhere very niche, it basically went something like this. They took a world of knowledge that looks like what you see on your screen right now. And they picked some items, usually just from this section here. Let's take a moment to just zoom in on that a little bit more. So they selected some items, most often from among the range of white, Western, Christian, colonialist, patriarchal priorities. Now, clearly that's a politically motivated choice, which is also a thought to hold, to refer back to shortly. Now, whether the items your school prioritized were selected from this little square or from elsewhere, either way, this teeny weeny little selection then got shaped into what is called a curriculum. And just in case you think I'm overstating the teeny weeny, let's consider that one of the cleverest people in recent history, AI pioneer and MIT educator Seymour Papert, estimated that human knowledge has reached the point where the most comprehensive curriculum imaginable can only cover 1/100000th of 1% of what has been documented so far of human knowledge. So no matter what was inside it, your school's curriculum was really, really teeny weeny. So they took whatever they'd selected and then they structured it further, because that's already a structuring, that's selection. They structured it further by mapping out a staged plan intended to install these curricular items into you at your various presumed stages of standardized development. And that's called a syllabus. And it was probably delivered with some more structure, using age-segregated plans for progressive grades based on a currently popular superstition about age as a reliable predictor of developmental readiness. Then another layer of structure, they made it compulsory for you to show up every weekday, most days of the year for 12 years. And that's, as an aside, the only known instance of governments managing to get away with sneakily converting a right into a legal obligation. And then they spent that time showering you with that curricular selection in the hopes that it would stick, using various forms of carrot and stick to try to guarantee that at least some of it would stick. And all of that is what added up to structure for your education. And on my little conceptual map, all of that took place over here in this section, gray section called imposed. And in case you're wondering why curriculum is only a tiny bit of what is imposed during the schooling process, that's because the rest of it is the generalized obedience training that's actually necessary in order to be able to deploy that curriculum and keep you in your seat. But we're really, really used to the idea that this is education and that this kind of structure is generally all we see. Our brains are trained to recognize this as education. And when parents or educators encounter alternative education, which involves all of this amazing, colorful stuff below, then it can be hard to trust. And they often respond that this can't possibly work for their child because their child needs structure. And what they mean by structure is that gray imposition on the top. But all of this, all of these colorful sections down here are actually structure. And different individuals learn through different blends of these various kinds of structure at different times. And the irony is that all of these other kinds of structure are actually educational, while the gray one at the top tends to be what Eugene Matchesov of the University of Delaware calls anti-educational. In other words, all of these other kinds of structures facilitate learning, while the imposed kind tends to prevent learning. And I argue that most of the really useful long-term and empowering learning that happens in a mainstream school setting happens in spite of imposed structure rather than because of it. But sadly, it's the only part of the map that most of us are aware of. Now, some of you might always be wondering, what's the problem? Why do I say sadly? If all curricula are guaranteed to be teeny weeny, surely we want the best possible teeny weeny, and that's best decided by experts. The problem being that every human is profoundly unique. And I don't see any way that I could ever know with 100% certainty what any other person would need to know in order to live their own life successfully for them personally. We can spend a lifetime getting to know somebody and they still mystify us. So if a curriculum can only ever be teeny weeny, surely it's best if it's personalized and as specific as possible, which brings us back to Sherlock Holmes. I would say that Dr. Watson, when he was trying to teach Sherlock about some basic cosmology, was actually advocating for the top-down form of structure. He was saying, I'm the doctor, I know that you need to know this in order to be culturally accepted. I will impose this learning on you. Whereas Sherlock, on the other hand, was advocating for structure from the bottom up. And what does that look like? Because that's where I use the analogy of the laser beam invisible until we throw some mist on it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a look at an older and wiser, I believe, structure that drives learning. And I'm going to call this our intrinsic structure, which is primed to direct us to learn and develop all of the specifics that are personally useful. Now, this is in place inside each of us. It functions well. It's always been there, and it's always functioned well. So why did we ever start using imposed structure instead? Now, if you're on an AERO call, you probably already know the answer to that. Basically, it started for political reasons, which brings us back to our little square earlier. Because intrinsic drives that drive our learning are so strong, and confident, self-realized people are hard to control, various early church and later state authorities realized that it was going to take a lot to override the human urge to self-direct one's own learning. So imposed structure was first used to drive out original sin, create soldiers for Reichs, workers for factories. In other words, imposed structures of education were created not to educate, but to indoctrinate and override natural education. So even to this day, we see that right now, children in some remote villages are forcibly removed and forced into colonial schools where they will be coercively westernized. And in cases like this, it's easy to see what's going on. But if we look closely, we can see that the same applies even to children who come from Western urban homes in the first place. Struggles in classrooms to this day attest to the fact that the intrinsic learning urges are very hard to override. And in an increasing number of cases, we even have to drug intrinsic drives into submission in order to be able to impose that top-down structure without resistance. So if imposed curriculum started from a place of religious fundamentalism and political oppression, why do we still do it? And I think it's simply that we're used to it now, and most of us don't know anything else. It's become custom, and honestly, the visible is so much more reassuring. It's much easier for a parent to trust in something they can see in black and white and say, that's what my child's going to be learning. There's the learning goals. This is how we've measured the outcomes. It's visible, so it's tangible. And that's why I think it's so important to spend some time making the bottom-up structure more visible so that we can actually get to know it, get a grip on it, and come to trust that too. So I am going to take you on a little journey to try and put some mist behind some of those lasers and have a look at the other layers of structure that are actually relevant to education. Because for me, the most exciting one is down here right at the bottom in the purple. I think that's the most powerful, but it's also the most invisible. And if we can get a good look at that one, it can change the way that we see. Because that's actually the one that drives all the others. And it's the only one that can make anything actually stick. Even the imposed curriculum from the top, I believe, doesn't stick, except to the extent that that very bottommost fundamental structure is engaged. So let's first start by taking a look at intrinsic structure. So intrinsic structure is innate, internal, intuitive, and largely invisible. And it relates to the educative drive of curiosity. So what I mean by intrinsic structure is the deep, internal, pretty much invisible structuring that's directed by our intuitive self. We're not generally conscious of our own intrinsic learning structuring. When we're just messing about with no particular aim in mind and we end up having a profound learning experience or an awesome inspiration or a sudden insight, that might feel like chance, but it's actually the result of complex, invisible structuring of our experience by our deep unconscious intuitive self. The intuitive self is what guides what humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers called our actualizing tendency. So Rogers saw this tendency as the foundational root of all that we are and all that we do, and defines it as, one quote, a striving to actualize, maintain, and enhance the experiencing organism. And he saw this as the fundamental motivational driver of all human development, emotion, and behavior. And if everything we do is rooted in the need to self-actualize, then obviously learning is also rooted in this tendency. What is more self-actualizing than our education? But is there really structuring happening at this level? So to look at the definitions that pop up in the Google Dictionary for structure, it is to construct or arrange according to a plan, to give a pattern or organization to it. And the structure of something refers to the arrangement and the relations between the parts or elements of something complex. Now, when it comes to education in particular, One Tony Bates, author of Teaching in a Digital Age, offers a very nice working definition for structure in education. He says that structure in education refers to the choice, breakdown, and sequencing of the curriculum or content, along with the deliberate organization of student activities. So to the extent that our intuitive self chooses, breaks down, and sequences our learning, and organizes our learning activities, we can say that that is structuring our learning. Now, we firstly know that our unconscious attention is definitely directed and selective in a way that drives our learning choices and organizes our learning activities constantly, right from birth. Babies look at faces more than other objects, for example, and they take a few hours to learn to recognize their mothers. And throughout the whole of our lives, each of us attends to different details than the person alongside us might notice. If you've ever been to a movie, well, we've all been to watched movies with friends and loved ones and come out of that movie with completely different insights, completely different memories, having noticed this scene or that scene that the other person didn't particularly attend to. Even look at my little memory of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. I mean, those books are this thick, and I think there's 2 to 3 volumes on my shelf. And that's one paragraph that has stuck in my mind all of those years. Whereas I can't even remember what many of the other stories were about. And that's because of my focus on education. Other people might not have remembered that little scene at all. So even identical twins have different preferences and affinities. Why do you like orange best, red second best, and hate green, while I like blue better than purple, but not as much as yellow? These selections, hierarchies, orderings, and relationships between my affinities form a structure that drives me to attend to and select certain activities rather than others. Furthermore, my personal pattern of growth and development and my biorhythms are also unconscious, but they also drive the structure of my learning. I was fascinated to see that with both of my children, their learning to read process took place exclusively last thing before bed, when they were really getting a grip on it, late at night. And there's a reason why I don't feel like doing woodwork at all this week, but next week I'll do almost nothing else. Why I might not write any songs for month on end, and then write 2 in a week. Why you love maths and physics, and I don't. So there's a variety of factors that structure our curiosity, our creative desire, our affinities, our timing, and more, without us being consciously aware of how that's happening and why and what's actually going on. So self-directed education sees wisdom in this structuring because it works in favor of our learning process. So if you look at the writings of Daniel Greenberg, the founder of Sudbury Valley School, you'll find this constantly in his work using different terms. When he speaks of the discipline that even a tiny baby uses in building their own personal model of reality, or when he speaks of the rules that are hidden even within the simplest forms of solitary play, he's articulating his insights into the functioning of this innate actualizing tendency and his awareness of its intrinsically structuring activity in the learning process. Intrinsic structure is the wisdom that shapes our obsessions and drives our focus on a particular learning activity. It's what switches that obsession on, and it's what switches that obsession off once we've had our fill for now. Intrinsic structure dictates how long we'll digest what we've learned and how long we'll incubate before our next exploration or creative output. So intrinsically learning structures feel natural or automatic to us. And because they're basically invisible from the outside, our activities can seem unfocused or without purpose, which is where people visiting a Sudbury school for the first time can often be really freaked out, that it looks like the kids are doing nothing. However, intrinsic structure is what helps us learn our first language, focuses our curiosity, urges us to experiment, guides us into which interactions will be meaningful, guides us away from those that are trivial, gives us aversions to activities that we're not ready for, fills us with longing for adventure, sends us into midlife crises in order to grow, and more. We all learn things this way all the time, all our lives. And once we recognize that, it can be hard for schooled minds to accept that this is an effective way of learning things such as reading or maths, even still. Because intrinsic structure is a bit like air. It's visible mostly due to its invisibility. But it would be a big mistake to think that air is empty space, when in fact it's the one thing we can't even be alive for 5 minutes without. And it's an equally big mistake to think that when we can't see anything happening, that means that learning isn't underway. Parents and SDE facilitators often experience that some young people learn to read and nobody knows how. It just seemed to happen. And that's an example of intrinsic structure at play, which I'll dig into a little bit later. I'm going to take us through an example of a child learning to read, looking at all of the different kinds of structure. But like air, you can see intrinsic structure when you know where to look. And this is why Sudbury Valley staff and other SDE facilitators are very careful about interrupting students even when they seem not to be busy, and why boredom is valued rather than avoided in Sudbury style education. I always think of Christopher Robin in the A.A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh books, just wandering through the 100 Acres Wood, doing nothing in particular, dropping twigs in the stream. The daydreamer, the person who seems to be fiddling with things without a clear plan in mind, the person going with the flow in a way that seems to be without direction. All of this is not quite as aimless as it seems. And it can be more valuable than it looks, and it can make the difference between creative, inspired work and mediocrity. Most creative insights come in a flash when we're finally ready to let go, taking a stroll, for example. And intrinsic structure is what makes it possible for those aha eureka moments that so often arrive while we're brushing our teeth or riding the train, rather than while our efforts are engaged. If we think about Newton not doing anything particular when the apple fell, Archimedes chilling out in his bath, inspiration, insight, beginner's luck, all the mysteries of savant syndrome and what we sometimes mistake for savant syndrome, I believe all of these belong to that root of intrinsic structure. I'll give you one example from my personal life. My son at 6, which is exactly the age that school would have had him sitting down at a desk learning to sit still, spent hours upon hours outside. Guess what? Throwing dust into the air, throwing dust into the air, throwing dust into the air. For, he said, no particular reason. When I asked him why he was doing it, it's just like, I don't know. Now, I believe most schools would have said that was an aimless waste of time. But a year later, he randomly picked up a friend's toy airplane and explained to me why the design meant that it would never be able to fly in real life. Because it turns out that his dust tossing had helped him develop his intuitive understanding of aerodynamics. And being somebody who's very interested in physics and in the design of machines, this was an important learning activity for him to undertake that nobody else could ever have prescribed. But his intrinsic structuring of his own education gave him the desire to spend hours upon hours upon hours simply throwing dust up into the wind. Now, it's tempting to deny that there's structure involved in these kinds of examples, but without selective focus and some kind of acquisition strategy, the development and the retention wouldn't happen. I'm going to move up this little picture now, because when we start to see intrinsic structure, when the casual observer can see that something's going on, when signs of this invisible process emerge in ways we can more easily notice and go, ah, yes, there's something going on, then I call that emergent structure, because it's starting to emerge from its invisibility. So emergent structure is when intrinsic structure becomes overt enough to be really noticeable. Literally, when we can see it rather than just have faith that it is there. And emergent structure is therefore also generally the tip of a much bigger intrinsic iceberg. This is still directed by the deep intuitive self. And this is where we find that play is one of the educational drives. And emergent structure relates to the educative drive of playfulness. So if somebody's fiddling with a spoon for no apparent reason while we're chatting, and then they absent-mindedly start balancing the spoon on their finger, then I could notice that this fiddling is actually an unconscious experiment to find the spoon's center of mass. The fiddling that looked completely aimless was part of the same experiment, but only when the attempt to find balance emerged, then does it become apparent to me what's actually going on. And those of us with SDE experience have seen that this kind of game often leads to further strategies that eventually add up to an effective mastery of some kind. Whereas to schooled eyes, it looks pointless and not nearly sufficient to lead to real accomplishment, which is why classrooms, one of the reasons classrooms tend to shut it down. It can be exciting for us to intentionally treasure hunt, and I often encourage facilitation, people who are learning facilitation to treasure hunt for examples of emergent structure to observe, because it gives us a glimpse of this deep self-direction, and it can help build our trust that intrinsic structure is really operating. Now, moving up again, up through these pictures, up into the green, into the self-generated. A common next step, if somebody's been fiddling with a spoon and then they start playing with the balance without noticing what they're doing, a common next step would be to start intentionally and strategically working on ways to get the spoon to balance, which then would be what I call self-generated structure. So self-generated structure is when conscious goals and planning appear for the first time. And for this reason, this is also the level of structure that most people start recognizing as structure. And it relates obviously to the educative drive of planfulness. And self-generated learning structures are governed by what I call the ego self, which is the level on which we are self-aware. We've got a conscious sense of autonomy, and we have the ability to choose to do things. Self-generated structures involve activities which the young person personally creates, or the adult personally creates, and consciously undertakes on their own initiative, apparently just for their own pleasure still, such as deciding to see how far they can hop on one leg before touching the other foot to the ground, or randomly choosing to count all the pencils in the box, or rescuing a drowning snail and then making a habitat for it. So goals and plans are in play. They could be as complex as I am going to invent a new kind of solar panel, or they could be as simple as I am going to count all the sweets in the bag. But either way, the activity is conscious and deliberate. And if you ask the person, what are you doing? They will generally be able to tell you. Moving up our diagram to the yellow. Is it yellow? I've got to go and check on my picture. Yep, yellow. We come to co-created structure. And this is the learning structure that's co-created by the learner in collaboration with somebody else. So in SDE, this is likely to be a collaboration between young people, although it can also be sometimes with a facilitator. In other models, it's usually with a teacher. For example, 3 young people might decide together to see who can hop on one leg for the longest, and use a timer to help them keep track as they try to beat their own records. Or a young person and a staff member could challenge each other to find specific places on a map. And co-created structure is directed by what I call the social self. And indeed, this level of structure and the 2 which follow relate to the educative drive of sociability. We moderate our plans and our self-expression due to the social influence of the people around us. Now, co-created learning structures are part of the power of age mixing in self-directed education, in that young people with different levels of knowledge, maturity, and experience often co-create far richer structures than a more homogeneous mix, but they also create more user-friendly structures than adults in interaction with children because of the closer kinship of the differently aged people compared to the increasingly alien experience of the adult. Now moving up the next level in our little picture, we go to the orange of adopted structure. Now, what I call adopted structure is a learning structure that somebody else has created that we choose to use, and we make it our own by using it in our own way. For example, I could sign up for a Udemy course, but I decide to only watch the bits of each video that most interest me and fast forward through the rest. and oh, I don't feel like doing any of the assignments. And when people first hear about self-directed education or make their first moves beyond homeschooling or towards unschooling, they often assume that adopted structures are what SDE must be all about. Because it's hard for us from a school background to get our heads around learning that doesn't involve recognizable schoolish resources in some way, at least. And it's easier to understand the kind of self-directed education that involves the use of existing resources in flexible, consent-based and creative ways. But even more usually, they expect that SDE will involve the next one up, which I call imported structure. And that's in the red. Now, when we import a learning structure, we take on the whole of an externally created structure as it is, and we comply with it. So if I sign up for a ballet class, for example, most ballet classes are very strict in terms of when you will do your pliés and when you will start doing pirouettes, and it's highly structured. Or if I'd sign up for my Cambridge O-levels or A-levels, or I do a Khan Academy course, or I'd sign up even for an extramural baking class, but there's set recipes that the teachers decided, and that's what we're going to do. Certain types of art lessons, certain types of music lessons are all typical of imported structure, because the self-directed aspect there is limited to consent and choice, and only consent and choice. The young person chooses to join or to leave and how much effort to put in. And this kind of self-directed education, you can see very nicely with our common ancestor Summer Hill School, where classes were left the same as in other schools, national curriculum is followed, but young people can choose whether to attend or whether to spend their time out of class using all of these other learning structures that I've been looking at here. So choice and consent are the difference between imported structure and imposed structure, the gray at the top. So an imposed structure is something that the young person is forced or tricked or pressurized or bribed or seduced or otherwise manipulated to take on and comply with. And when still deschooling, it's easy to be confused about this. So for example, numerous families will say that they're unschooling when what they mean is that they took the child out of school and now instead they have a reading or maths tutor or a tutor center where the child does what they have to, and the rest of their time is free. But any time that somebody is under pressure to participate, even in a fun extramural, that's imposed structure. Now, let's just go through the whole sequence again in a different way to help make things clearer. And I'm going to do that by looking at the example of learning to read. So obviously, when we start from the top down, we would simply impose a structure and we'd say, you are going to learn to read now, like this, following these instructions with these lessons, and that's how you're going to learn to read. How do we do it when we come from the bottom up? So intrinsic structure is influenced by the young person's developmental readiness, firstly, social cues that reading is important, general life context, and it inspires a desire to understand the sounds that go with symbols. So again, this is going to be highly personalized, what happens next. So the intuitive self will come up with some or other series of strategies to master reading. It'll be completely personalized, but for example, they might start paying attention to symbols and notice that many of them correlate with sounds. They might start wondering about the sounds of all new symbols noticed. So there's structuring rules happening there in terms of I will pay attention to symbols and I will listen out to discover what they stand for. But I'm not even conscious of the fact that I'm doing it. It's automatic. Another possibility down at the intrinsic level would be I might unconsciously notice that mommy always says the same word when there's the same pattern on the page of the bedtime story book. So the rules there that are structuring things would be listen to the words, notice the patterns, unconsciously collect the correlations. But the young person is often not even conscious of this learning structure. They're not doing something on purpose. It's something that's just happening. And this kind of structure isn't something we can usually see from the outside unless we really know how to look. And it's what most of us wouldn't think of as structure at all. However, it is true that in self-directed education, sometimes kids learn to read like this without anyone being able to say how it happened. And sometimes even the young person concerned can't explain it or tries to create explanations rather than really seeming to know how they did it. And this kind of learning is directed by the intuitive self using intrinsic structure. Now, not everybody is going to learn purely at that invisible level and suddenly turn out to be able to read. On other occasions, when it's still very much from the bottom up, we can actually spot what's happening, and that's when we call it emergent structure. So using our learn to read illustration again, perhaps the young person starts asking, what does that say? Or starts trying to recognize number plate letters, or starts trying to read street signs, such that this becomes a kind of a game. So the first person I watched learn to read, in South Africa, we've got a lot of crime and we've got a lot of private security companies, and they all have their little adverts on your gate. If you've signed up for them, then they put their little plaque on your gate. And he was going around reading ADT, Trojan. So the structuring rules here involve trying to decode symbols when they are noticed. But by now, the young person is probably aware that they are doing something. And by paying close attention, most of us can see that there is structure for learning going on here. But it wasn't deliberately generated. The experience is still spontaneous, and it's not goal-directed. It's apparently for its own sake. And it seems to have learning as a kind of a side effect to the game. In some cases, again, this is quite enough, and the young person will simply learn to read with this level of structure visible. In other cases, the activity may go to a stage where the learning process becomes structured in what I call a self-generated way. So to extend the learn to read illustration up to self-generated structure, perhaps the young person decides that they will learn to recognize all of the names of the Minecraft spawn eggs, or they're going to learn to recognize all of the names of their family and friends. So the structuring rules here would include choosing a list that is personally meaningful and working to decode that list until it is either mastered or until the learner loses interest because of that fundamental intrinsic structure cueing them to take a break. At this stage, almost everybody can see that there's a learning structure operating, and we can see its intentional behavior and that it's part of a larger process that could realistically end up in mastering reading. Plans and goals have come into play, and even non-SDE education can recognize that there's learning going on, although many educators still wouldn't consider this a valid educational activity worth spending time on. To go to the next part up of the continuum, once a young person asks me to help them learn to read, and we negotiate together, how will that look? Whether for just right now, this reading session, or the whole of the month, then we're co-creating a structure for learning. So one that some kids have enjoyed with me is we'll divide up the sentence, and you do the words that you want to do, and I'll do all the rest. Or you, like for example, right at the beginner level, when they're still not actually decoding yet, they'll, for example, choose to do the character's name every time. And I'll be tracing along with my finger, and when we get to the character's name, they'll read the character's name. So all kinds of games that are co-created between people would be part of the co-created structure level. There could be other examples, like they could I've seen kids, for example, playing a game where one writes a word and the other tries to read it. Or they might be cutting out letters from a magazine and then working together on how to make a game of almost like bingo, putting them in order. So at this point, just about any educator can recognize that there's learning going on. Some wouldn't consider it desirable, but most would at least grudgingly acknowledge that it's valid. Then moving up again to adopted structure. When we look at somebody adopting structure to learn to read, perhaps they would use a series of beginner readers, for example. That's a structure that somebody else has created, but at the adopted level, they might read them out of order. They might pick the ones that look like they've got fun topics. They might only read a few words on each page, or they might use the pictures to actually decode the story rather than bothering with the words. They would be using an external resource, but they'd be completely making it their own and using it their own way. My daughter, for example, at one point spent a little bit of time on the Starfall website, starfall.com. It's got lots of reading resources, but she didn't do it in order. She flitted around to the games she liked doing. She didn't progressively go with the structure that they had suggested. So she had adopted that. On the other hand, if we move up again, they would be importing the structure if, for example, they ask you to teach them to read your way and then they do as you instruct them to do. Or they would take on a set of readers or phonics books or an online resource and they would work through it in the designated order, methodically, doing every exercise. And then, of course, finally, we end up back in the gray at the top. Imposed structure would be they are taught to read whether they want to or not, or taught to read by using a method or timing that they have no say in, or a subtler form of imposed structure. They might be pressured by the parent or somebody else to say, for example, I've paid for that Starfall membership, now you need to use it properly. So that now we've gone through all of the different kinds of learning structure again. And now I'd like to take a little bit of a look at how these map to different educational approaches, because people generally look at the educational landscape and see a wide variety of options, huge variety of options. Whereas when I look at the educational landscape, I see exactly two. One is top down and the other is bottom up. And I think that all of the approaches to education pretty much, I believe, can be mapped out to either you're going top down or you're going bottom up. So reality obviously isn't as neat and tidy as, well, not that my diagram's neat and tidy at all. Far from it. But reality isn't as broken down into labels. In real life, everything is very organic and fluid and mixed. So learning generally takes place with combinations and blends of structure types. But artificially dividing it into categories can just help us articulate and understand more clearly what's going on and what our options are. And it can also help us see which educational approach is which, because different approaches value and rely on these different types of structures to varying degrees. Why do I spend so much time on intrinsic structure compared to all of the others, for example? And that's because my passion is for self-directed education. And intrinsic structure is the thing that self-directed education values in a way that no other approach to learning values. So you will find a self-directed education facilitator vehemently defending the child's right to do nothing, to muck about, to play all day, because we have a very, very strong sense of the importance of intrinsic structure and how crucial it is to really allow it to build its muscle and learn how to operate to the full. Whereas if you're coming from the top down, intrinsic structure is the enemy. This child is daydreaming, this child is fiddling, this child is fidgeting. So intrinsic structure is really the key differentiator that's going to tell you where you are on the educational map. And then, of course, there's many other approaches to education that would value some of these others in between to various degrees. But the interesting thing that I've noticed over time is that, for example, if you look at a progressive education classroom where they're co-creating the structure, For example, the teacher and the kids are deciding, how are we going to do this thing? And they're making a game. You can still, if you look closely, find out, did they reach that co-created structure by coming from the top down, or did they reach that co-created structure by coming from the bottom up? What's the ultimate value? Is the ultimate value that they are using the co-created structure to try and help that imposed structure get a grip and stick? Or are they using the co-created structure as a natural emergent expression that came up originally from that intrinsic structure at the base? So everything else is rooted in intrinsic structure. An intrinsic structure is actually the only one that can stand alone. Like the roots of a tenacious plant, you can chop off everything at the top and it'll send up new shoots. So intrinsic structure is actually the only level that is both necessary and sufficient for learning to happen. To the extent that intrinsic structure is not engaged, learning won't take place. Just like if you cut off a leaf or a branch from the root, it won't live unless you can do something to provide new root growth. So in my analogy there, if we look at imposed structure, there's a reason why most of the curriculum that's coercively imposed doesn't stick. What we see is, the summer slide, and the fact that a year after you've left school, you wouldn't be able to pass the same test, the fact that parents can't help their kids with homework, because only to the extent that somehow intrinsic structure manages to become engaged with that imposition will something stick, which is where I remember hardly anything from history or geography classes that I was forced to take, but I remember quite a lot from biology, because although it was imposed on me coercively, that resonated with my natural interests. And so there were times when I was actually engaging in a genuine way in spite of that imposition. So a lot of progressive education is actually about strategies to get that imported structure to trickle down and use some of those lower levels to help it to stick. But intrinsic structure itself is the most invisible, the most ignored, and the most neglected, but the most important, which is why I spend so much time on it. Because most educators don't know about it, don't understand it, don't value it, and therefore don't prioritize it. And even more than mere neglect, many pedagogical approaches actively attack and undermine intrinsic structure, which is where we see people becoming what I really call learning disabled lifelong. A lot of us giggle in self-directed education when people ask us questions and we spend 1 minute in Google and then send them the link. And we go, why couldn't they have done it? But when intrinsic structure is attacked, we often end up with that kind of learned helplessness, lack of confidence, lack of being able to actually find one's own strategies. So deschooling is largely the process of allowing young people to heal out the damage that has been done by that imposition, giving them time to reconnect with intrinsic structure and time to strengthen that kind of deep self-direction. And I want to just read you a quote from Jim Rittmulder. Agency is like muscle, stronger with work, weaker without. Just as physical inactivity weakens muscles, chronic restraint of children's choice and action weakens their ability to choose and act. So this is also why intrinsic structure is a key differentiator for self-directed education, and why respect for this level of self-direction is core and necessary to self-directed education in order for it to be self-directed education. Without a solid and practically implemented respect for this level of self-direction, SDE isn't really the same thing that Greenberg, Gray, and other SDE writers are working to describe. So the facilitator who has an intuitive respect for learning that is intrinsically structured is likely to be an effective SDE facilitator, whether or not they can explain anything about SDE or not. Whereas the rest of us generally have to go through a process of learning to trust intrinsic structure, which is where facilitators also need to de-school. And for as long as we harbor a suspicion of the power of intrinsic structure, our facilitation will be more suited to progressive education than to SDE. So I often spend some time when people come to me and say, oh yeah, no, I want to become an SDE facilitator. I go, do you? Let's have a look, you know, because very often their comfort zone won't extend any lower than a certain point in this diagram. Very often they're happy with that yellow co-created area. That feels good to them. That's what they want to do. The moment they start getting to self-generated, it feels iffy. There's not enough guidance there. They're not comfortable with it. And I say, no, you know, it's like, you know, why don't you go rather study progressive? Because the SDE, maybe that'll come down the line. Maybe, you know, again, we've got to respect that person's intrinsic structure. Because if we try to impose an SDE training on somebody whose intrinsic structure is not engaging with that, it's not going to stick. And for the sake of kids, it's going to be better to keep their facilitators honest about what they can and can't cope with, so that the kids can actually get the kind of facilitation that's going to support them in their best as well. So self-direction is driven by intrinsic structure. And when this is respected and it's the origin of all of the educational choices, then all of these other structures, except the very last one, still fall into SDE. Because this is also something that people find quite confusing. They go, oh, they're not doing SDE anymore because they've gone back to school. If a child genuinely chooses to go back into a coercive school, but it's really their own choice, they're actually importing the structure. It's theirs, but it's my choice, and it's still rooted in intrinsic at the bottom. I know, for example, if I think of Harry Thompson, he wrote the Pda Paradox. I won't go into what PDA is because that's a whole other kettle of fish. But he intrinsically knew that in order to master himself, he had to put himself in the most coercive situation possible. So he signed up for the army for 2 years, which was a profound learning experience for him to be able to master that environment. As coercive as it gets, but it was rooted in his intrinsic structure. So it was imported, not imposed. So these are two competing is's of educational reality. We have the is of imposed structure, trying to co-opt the other learning structures away from the intrinsic structure isness. We try to get the child to consent to the curriculum. We try and get them to import it. We try to get them to make it their own and find a way to artificially hook up the intrinsic motivation of the intrinsic structure systems by using social interaction to co-create games and challenges and project-based and hands-on methods of delivery to get it all the way down to self-generated. But we're coming from the top, assuming that the thing we want to do is impose this thing we know they need to learn. And then we're moving down to try and get them to do all of these other things as a way to engage that purple at the bottom and make something stick. So to the extent that we happen to coincide with something that's already there and it then does appear to work, to the extent that we happen to not coincide with what intrinsic structure is already directing, then the so-called learning is lost as soon as we stop its artificial life support system. So again, if we think of that analogy of the tree, and if we cut a plant from its roots, we can put it in a vase, we can put it in water, we can add little sachets of plant food to the water, and it looks like that thing is still alive. But the moment that that stops or a certain amount of time passes, it dies, which is where you see imposed learning We can make it stick long enough for the exam. We can make it stick for a while. We can keep refreshing it. And this is also why conventional schooling systems do so much repetition year after year after year to try and keep that going. But when the school phase ends, it's gone. I still can't tell you 99% of what I learned, even in the subjects that I was interested in. So when we start from the top down, we mistakenly believe that the imposed structure is where all the value lies. We don't want to get too far away from it. And this is why most progressive education approaches tend to focus on the structures closest to the top. The bravest go lower. And most first attempts to fix what's broken about school consist of trying to improve imposed structure itself. So we work hard to include alternative items in the imposed curriculum, for example, under the impression that making children learn about human rights might set them free, or heritage traditional skills in there will help them decolonize, or yoga and meditation will make them better people, or climate justice information will inspire them to heal the world. But all of this remains imposed, and to the extent that it doesn't happen to coincide with the concerns of their intuitive self, it won't stick. It won't be accurately internalized. And ironically, it's most likely to stick as an aversion to whatever it is we aimed to instill, because coercion generally creates pushback. So sometimes, instead of changing what's in the curriculum, the main attempt we make is to make that imposition kinder and gentler and look less violent, the spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down. But even activities that are made fun and done in a child-friendly, creative, playful, colorful way are still imposed, because given a real choice, the child would actually choose to do something else. In other words, that activity is not rooted in the self. It doesn't emerge as a result of self-direction, and therefore it's nowhere other than still up there in the gray. The key to moving out of imposition and down into the realm of real learning is consent. So once we decide that young people have the right to consent, to say yes and no, refuse everything we offer, explore beyond the menu, rather than merely giving them a choice between limited options, that's when we finally leave the realm of anti-education and allow for real learning journeys. And this is why imported structure is usually the very first resort of new homeschoolers heading towards SDE, as well as the first strategy offered by cottage schools and facilities that offer a haven for young people escaping from coercive education. They start looking for, okay, we need at least to add consent. So you take your imposed structure and you try to actually stop imposing it. So imported structure is exactly the same as imposed structure, except that there is genuine consent. So when people are correct, when they say for a particular child, oh, mainstream schooling really works for this one, it's a good option for this one, that would be because that particular individual genuinely chooses to be there, resonates with being there. And even though it's being imposed on their peers in the same room, their own learning is actually an importation. And at this level, the more that young people have a real choice about which curricula they take on, they have some choice about accommodations to make their compliance with those curricula comfortable and enjoyable, to the extent that they have the option to do something else if they wish to, then it's truly imported, even if, as I say, for the rest of everybody in the room, it might be imposed. To the extent that they don't have the option to drop it and move out of the room, then it is imposed and not an import, no matter how much the adults in charge want to think that it is, which is where the ability to vote with one's feet is the first thing that we have to offer if we want to start moving into genuine learning. So it is possible for a young person to genuinely choose to import a structure for their learning, and it still is SDE, because it's still ultimately rooted in intrinsic structure, and therefore it is still self-directed, directed by the self. So sociability is also engaged during this process through our contracts with instructors and institutional structures. So a teacher or coach may fairly agree to help us only on certain conditions, for example, like you must arrive consistently on time or put in a certain amount of effort, do your homework. Those contractual terms and conditions might be set up at a higher level, even by the institution, such as fees, dress code, rules and restrictions on behavior. But in self-directed education, we have a choice about whether or not to enter into these agreements. We can choose to terminate or break these agreements and walk away. And this is where it becomes an interesting oxymoron for a parent to force a young person to attend an SDE facility against their will, because then it's no longer an SDE facility for them. So you can never look at the room and say whether it's an imposition or as an intrinsic. You always have to look at consent to find out. So Sudbury type facilities leave it up to young people to request or initiate the provision of structures to import. And their students sometimes do import structures, although not as often as school minds expect them to. Agile learning centers, liberated learners, unschooling co-ops, they all vary in their offerings. But essentially, any time that the teacher or course designer decides what will be covered when and how, then that's a structure that the young person does or doesn't choose to import. So it's still within SDE as long as there's that consent. And likewise, there's nothing to prevent students from adopting structures in SDE. It's just necessary that they freely choose to use or not use, and that they be free to adapt and assimilate the structure in their own way. If the young person is pressured even subtly to adopt or import something or use it only in the improved ways, that's when it stops being rooted in the intrinsic structure and becomes imposed structure masquerading as adopted structure. Now, this is also where strewing comes in. Strewing is a term coined by. You can tell that it's early in the morning here. It's a term coined by Sandra Dodd to describe the way that we can make young people aware of resources and possibilities with zero pressure to respond to our having done so. So the classic way to do this is leave things lying around. You can also simply tell or show young people about what you think they might be interested in. There's nothing wrong with making externally designed resources and structures available and visible, as long as there's truly no pressure, which is difficult to achieve if you're coming from a top-down mentality. Because the danger comes when we give young people subtle or unsubtle messages implying that it's much wiser to adopt a structure rather than co-create or self-generate or simply stay with emergent and intrinsic. And this often happens in SDE settings, which is a real problem because most of us who've not yet thoroughly deschooled can be quite afraid of intrinsic, emergent, and even up to co-created structure. So we're likely to give this message either explicitly or implicitly. So you're interested in maths. Oh, got a Khan Academy course for you. You know, oh, you're interested in this topic. Here's a book. Here's a website. Oh, you should ask this person. Because we get more comfortable the moment that we know that it's going to be co-created, at least there'll be some guidance. Young people are completely surrounded by these influences telling them they ought to do things in conventional ways. And anxiety is common for them as a result. So to the extent that somebody is anxious about trusting their own intrinsic process, then they might be importing or adopting structures because they are afraid they're not getting the affirmation from the adults around them that their intrinsic structure is actually okay, which is where we get a very subtle form of imposed, in that the person really seems to be choosing it for themselves. But when we look closely, we see that they're doing it from a place of anxiety that's actually rooted in a lack of the optimizing conditions of enough access to adults who are helpers, not judges, and insufficient immersion in a community that is truly respectful of imported structure and self-direction. So when a young person imports or adopts a structure, it needs to be from a place of exploration, desire for challenge, desire for novelty and variety, new forms of play, and to meet their own objectives, because then they're still rooted in that is of intrinsic structure, and therefore it's still self-directed education. Whereas the moment that young people are pushed to import or adopt structures rather than following their own intrinsic, emergent, and co-created, then we're in imposed structure, even if we're in a self-directed facility or family. Understanding this can help parents and facilitators understand why they might not be seeing the results they hoped for from a particular learning activity, given that only when it's rooted in intrinsic structure will things stick. Now, true progressive education reaches all the way down to co-created structure, and programs such as self-design are rooted in co-created structure. Most educators consider this level of structure a bit safer and more effective than the lower down ones, because the facilitator is able to monitor and shape this kind of structure. The school's assumption is that the teacher knows best, and so their influence must automatically be beneficial. And this level of structure is what frightened parents want to see in SDE, at least, to give them reassurance that their willful child won't be hedonistically flailing around in unproductive play, but at least will have some real guidance. And the matter of which is we are actually rooted in arises here depending on who initiates the co-creation and how much power does each participant have, as well as the question of whether or not the learner has the final say. So if the young person both initiates and has the final say, then the co-created structure is most likely rooted in intrinsic structure. If they don't have the initiative and the final say, it's probably an actually camouflaged imposed structure. And this makes it important to be careful when we're co-creating with young people, because it's very, very easy for adults to leap in with suggestions that are too far beyond where they're currently at and ruin the structure. We need to stay closely child-led. It's also easy for us to confuse a young person's request for company and interaction with a request for co-creation, because a highly social or a currently lonely young person might simply want company or witnessing, and they might tolerate our moving into co-create in order to keep us engaged, even when they would actually do better without our input. And also for this reason, sometimes people believe that a certain young person needs more structure simply because they are very social. And it's hard for schooled minds to imagine simply being with a young person who is learning without actually influencing and moving into co-create their learning. But it's perfectly possible for a mindful SDE facilitator to accompany and witness without getting in the way of the self-generated, emergent, and intrinsically structured activity. So coming from the imposed structures up on top that we're used to, self-generated structure is a long stretch away from most people's comfort zones. And facilitators who are new to SDE might assume that that's as far as it can go or should go. So everything must be visible and done according to self-chosen but explicitly stated plans. So the danger of preventing young people from investing time into emergent and intrinsic learning and pushing them only towards things that are clearly self-generated gives them the message that self-direction is only approved when it comes from the conscious ego self, which is quite immature usually, and its motivations are simple and very context-driven, because the plans it can make without intuitive input are confined to what's consciously understood, without room for intuition and inspiration. The result is learning and knowledge patterns that are reactive instead of proactive, because they're driven usually by external rewards, notions of betterment and survival, and it can be quite detrimental both to the individual and to society, because neither are granted the unique solutions that unlock real progress. The intuitive self, on the other hand, depending on your worldview, is where soul, spirit, destiny, purpose, and actualizing tendency reside. So when ego self is grounded in and guided by an empowered intuitive self, that's when self-generated structures can emerge naturally and continuously from emergent and intrinsic structures. And I'm going to wrap up now because I think we do need some time for questions. So I just want to briefly have a few final comments here in that Sometimes it seems that progressive is reaching all the way down into emergent, because we'll watch the child closely and look at what we call the emergent curriculum. The problem being, if we're again coming from the top down, we're going to be looking at how to co-opt what we see emerging in order to make our impositions stick. It's very, very important that we're keeping company with what the child is generally doing from the bottom up.